The Scroll of Esther, the last of the 5 Megillot or scrolls, is found in the third part of the Hebrew Bible known as the writings, Ketuvim. It is the only biblical book which does not explicitly contain the name of God, and yet the hidden but ever-present divine initiation of and involvement with the events described in the Megillah is assumed and obvious. The story of Purim is set in the city of Shushan in ancient Persia, at a time when the reigning king was known as Ahasuerus. According to the biblical text and rabbinic commentaries, it was a time of a settled and relatively prosperous Jewish community, exiled to Persia years before.
Purim is a festival of mystery. It's the mystery of the interaction of light and dark, of illusion and reality, of the internal and the external, the seeming meaning of things and their real, deeper meanings. Purim is also a festival in which we are asked to look inside of us, our own darkness, our own light, to learn what is real, what is illusion. Everything in Purim goes upside down. Nothing is as it is. Those at the bottom end up on the top. Those on the top end up on the bottom. It's a festival of deep, deep relationship of events and meaning and purpose.
The story begins with a large and impressive feast held by King Ahasuerus for all his princes, the nobles, and servants. The king wanted to flaunt the riches of his glorious kingdom and his magnificence. At this feast, Ahasuerus, in his merrily drunken state, ordered his wife Vashti to display her beauty before the people and the princes. But the queen refused to come at the king's command. This refusal made the king extremely angry, and burning with humiliation, he ordered for the queen to be hanged. The king then begins his search for a new queen, and he summons all the young women of his land to be presented to him. One of these is Esther, Hadassah, who had changed her name to Esther so that the king would not know that she was Jewish. Esther, who was orphaned at a young age, was being looked after by her uncle Mordecai. When the king laid eyes on Esther, he was smitten, placing the royal crown upon her head and making her queen. This allowed Esther to come to the fore and begin to fulfill her role of saving the Jewish people. Shortly afterwards, Mordecai discovers a plot by courtiers Bigthan and Teresh to kill Ahasuerus. They are apprehended and hanged, and Mordecai's loyalty to the king is recorded. This seeming aside becomes a crucial element in the eventual rise of Mordecai in the royal court to a position from which he can successfully humiliate and counter the intentions of the evil Haman. Haman, as prime minister of ancient Persia around 2,300 years ago, had become a powerful man in the kingdom. Mordecai, who sits at the palace gates, falls into Haman's disfavor as he refuses to bow down to him. Having found out that Mordecai is Jewish, Haman plans to kill not just Mordecai, but the entire Jewish minority in the empire. He succeeds in getting the king to authorize a royal decree to annihilate an unspecified nation he claims is an enemy of the king, sealing it with the king's ring against payment of 10,000 talents of silver. Upon hearing Haman's plans, Mordecai is distraught, demanding that Esther goes before the king and pleads with him to save the Jews from destruction. Unless invited into the king's inner court, no person is permitted in the presence of the king. To do so would mean death. It is only through the golden scepter that one may be excused. To this Mordecai replied that although Esther lives in the king's palace, she would not be exempt from this decree, and that in order to preserve the Jewish nation, she had no choice but to speak to the king. Esther commands Mordecai to gather the Jews of Shushan, and that they should all fast and pray for 3 days, saying that she shall speak to the king, and if she dies because of that, then that is the will of God. After 3 days, not knowing what his response will be, Esther presents herself before the king. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you desire, Queen Esther? For whatever you request, even to the half of the kingdom, it shall be given to you." Esther responds with an invitation for the king and Haman to join her in a banquet she has prepared for the following evening. Following courtly protocol, at that banquet, she invites them to yet a second banquet for the following day, at which she will reveal her request. The Megillah describes how joyful Haman was at being invited to a banquet of the king and queen alone, bragging to his wife and family the story of his rise to prominence and power. However, all of this was not enough for Haman, for his greatest wish was to see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate, bowing down to him. Seeing how upset he was, Zeresh his wife and all his friends said to him, "Why don't you build a gallows of 50 cubits high, and in the morning speak to the king about Mordecai's disregard for you and the king, and as punishment he should be hanged." Haman was excited about this idea and immediately ordered for the gallows to be built. The story in the Megillah now takes an unexpected turn. That night, King Ahasuerus suffers from insomnia, and when the court's records are read to him to help him sleep, he learns of how Mordecai had prevented a previous plot against his life. The king is told that Mordecai has not received any recognition for saving his life. When Haman appears, the king asks Haman what should be done for the man that the king wishes to honor. Thinking that the man who he wishes to honor is himself, Haman responds that the man should be dressed in the king's robes and led around on the king's royal horse. To Haman's horror, the king instructs Haman to do so to Mordecai. Later that evening, the king and Haman attend Esther's second banquet, at which she reveals that she is Jewish and that Haman is planning to exterminate herself and her people. Immediately, the king orders that Haman be hanged on the gallows which he prepared for Mordecai. The previous decree against the Jews could not be annulled, and the king allows Mordecai and Esther to write whatever decree they wished, thus writing one that allows the Jews to defend themselves during attacks. As a result, on the 13th day of Adar, 500 attackers and Haman's 10 sons were killed in Shushan. Mordecai is given a prominent position in Ahasuerus' court and institutes an annual commemoration of the delivery of the Jewish people from annihilation. Today, the festival of Purim is still celebrated by Jews around the world, and the legacy of Esther and Mordecai lives on.
But Purim is not just a holiday of confusion, it is a festival of revealing. A festival of revealing the inner meaning of events and of our own lives. The name of God never appears openly in the text, but the purpose of the festival of Purim and the reading of the Megillah, the scroll, is to help us understand that what may seem to be arbitrary, meaningless events that seem to come from nowhere and lead from nowhere are indeed the results of the hand and the intention and the will of the divine. It is one of the great themes of Purim that we come to understand that our task is to view all that occurs in our lives not just as random events, but reveal their inner meaning, their inner purpose, and what it teaches us about our own life tasks, our own soul work in this incarnation.
Now, Megillah is almost like a Torah, except you see it's only got one stick. Torahs have how many sticks?
Two.
And this story only has one. And it starts off, and it tells us the whole story of Purim.
There is a tradition on Purim that children make their own Megillot, their own scrolls of Esther. What may seem like a child's activity has deep, deep significance. Children reveal, and in most cases have not yet learned to conceal. And therefore they stand to us as a powerful symbol of what it means to be open to the world and open to godliness, even when it is seemingly obscured by physicality. There is a rabbinic tradition that in the face of the decree of destruction issued against the Jews, Mordechai gathered large numbers of Jewish children to learn Torah, the teachings of God, the law of Moses, and in that way to attempt to avert the evil decree. This is paralleled with the rabbinic teaching that when God on Mount Sinai wanted to give the Torah to the Jewish people, he asked what would be their surety that they would indeed follow its ways. And this teaching concludes with the children of Israel offering their children as the guarantors that the Torah would be lived and followed and studied for generations yet to come. And so it was of the power of teaching children Torah that Mordechai understood that redemption could come to the Jews.
It stops.
One of the mitzvot, holy commandments of the festival of Purim, is known as mashloch manot, the exchange of food gifts to each other, containing sweets and other traditional food, bringing enjoyment, pleasure, happiness, and other aspects of rejoicing.
There is another aspect to sweetness on a deeper level. Rabbinic sources speak to us of the fact that often sin and negativity and superficiality first appear in our lives as sweetness, as things to be savored, as things to be enjoyed. And therefore, if one is too concerned with life's sweetness, that it should be fun, that it should be happy at all moments, that it should be light, that one can be seduced by illusion. Because just as Mordechai and Esther had to literally put their lives on the line to bring salvation to the Jews, out of the bitterness of their efforts came sweetness to the Jewish people. Sweetness on its own is not always such a wonderful thing. Sweetness as the sweetness of accomplishment and success and effort, that is true pleasure and enjoyment.
What we are doing are sweets for Mishloach Manot. Especially in the Sephardi community, Mishloach Manot was kind of a festival, a rehearsal for Pesach. You did all those wonderful, intricate little sweets, and each housewife used to kind of compete with the other who made the best ones, because the honor of the house was on the quality of the Mishloach Manot. The first one that we are doing is Ojos De Hermano, which mean Haman's eyes. Those sweets were made especially for children who used to pluck the egg which decorated this little pastry as if plucking Haman's eye. It's a rich yeasty dough, and I'm using instant yeast because it makes the process a bit quicker. So first goes the yeast and the sugar, the oil, sesame seeds, anise seeds, pecan nuts, and raisins. Also goes 2 eggs, and I'll give that a good stir. And we add about 200 ml of water just to create a nice dough. I think that that's almost right. Yeah, about 2 or 3 minutes of nice kneading. Now, to keep it from drying, let me have a bit of oil. And what I do is that I oil my hands and oil that's it. Now, a cover. And it's left to rise for half an hour.
In some Jewish communities, there is a tradition of making and eating pastries which are understood to be the eyes of Haman, the one who intended to destroy the Jews and who was the arch opponent of Mordechai. There is a deep mystical significance to this as well, because we know in the Kabbalah and in other mystical traditions, there is the teaching of the incorporation and transformation of evil, that literally through consuming evil, especially within a community, one can transform it, can gain from its primal energy, but reform it from evil into blessing. And so we have this pastry, which is an aspect of Haman, that we eat together in festivity, in community. And through our mystical incorporation, we transform the energy of evil to the energy of good and blessing.
Well, with the magic of instant yeast, you see it's all raised up and wonderful. So what we have to do now is to knock it down, just to knock all the air out of it, and now finish it. We'll divide it into 6. 1. And from each one, I'll need to get a bit off, and you'll see why. and I roll them into little things. Off and 6. And now for the fun of it, to do Haman's eyes. And to do it, one can do it with a rolling pin, but I like doing those rounds with my hands. And from the bit that I reserved, I roll it to a long strand. Cut it into half, and then put a dyed egg in the middle to represent Haman's eye. And now, from the strands that I made just to hold the egg or the eye in its place, and then to decorate, I'm doing 4 slits. Before it goes to the oven, we'll glaze it with a bit of egg and sugar, so it will come out all glossy and nice. Okay, now for the final decoration, the egg, and now it's all ready to go to the oven, a hot oven, 180 degrees centigrade for about 20 to 25 minutes.
Another central mitzvah of Purim is called Matanos Le'Evyonim, of giving gifts to the poor. And again, this mitzvah contains numerous levels. On one level, of course, it is a mitzvah to include everyone in the community into the rejoicing and celebration of Purim, and so we must especially be concerned with the poor, that they be able to celebrate and participate as well. But there are also teachings in the rabbinic tradition that say that the poor are often more sensitive to divinity than those who live in different circumstances, for they know that literally their livelihoods depend on the beneficence of Hashem, of God, every single day. And therefore the poor have much to teach us about the sources of our livelihood and the sources of all that comes to us in our life.
When we read the Megillah in the synagogue, it is customary to block out the name of Haman with noisemakers called gruggers or rashanim, even though we are required to hear every single word from the Megillah.
So when we blot out the name of Haman, we are really doing two things which reflect the two main ways in which evil is to be dealt with in the world. At times it must be blotted out completely, but there are times, teaches Hasidus, when our animal soul is to be transformed and elevated so that it is in consonance and resonance with our divine soul. And so there is deep teaching in the blotting out of the name of Haman. How do we deal with evil? Do we destroy it? Do we transform it? Do we elevate it? Do we use its energy to create a better world? Sometimes one approach is required, and sometimes it is possible to follow the second path of transformation and elevation.
Another important tradition in Purim is dressing up in costumes, not just children, but adults as well. The underlying meaning in doing this is to conceal who we really are. Our status and social differences all disappear.
So in this holiday of illusion and reality and light and dark, to put on a costume is to raise the question, are we concealing who we are, or are we taking the opportunity to reveal who we wish we could be?
In the Hasidic tradition, we speak of shtush da kedusha, holy foolishness, the notion that often in our everyday world we close ourselves off to godliness itself. And therefore on Purim, we are expected to break the bounds and go beyond reason and order and enter a different state in which we can more clearly and openly experience divinity. Another of the central customs of Purim is the Seudah Purim, the Purim feast, which usually occurs towards the end of the afternoon. Again, on one level, it would seem obvious that on a day celebrating the salvation of the Jews from a decree of annihilation, we should celebrate, we should eat, and we should enjoy being with the community. As we learn in Hasidus in general, mitzvah kodolos lechios basimcha zomed, that it is a great mitzvah to always be joyful, as joy is one of the most powerful ways we connect with Hashem, our God.
Rabbi Nachman tells us that depression, that melancholia, that the down feelings that we often have dealing with the difficulties of this world cut us off from the divine light and the divine energy and the divine love. And therefore, no matter what the circumstances, no matter how difficult, it is important to be able to feast, to enjoy, to fulfill the mitzvah, and lios b'simcha tamid, always to know that the path to God is through joy, through the expansion of the heart, and through the elevation of the soul.
Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz.
One of the customs at the Seudah is to have a special challah, a special bread which we begin the meal with. According to some traditions, in some communities, a challah, which is often plain, is decorated in different colors and decorations, which we only ever see on Purim. The meaning behind this is to take something that is ordinary, and changing it slightly will release potentials and energies and insights and possibilities that we never knew existed before.
As with Purim, so in our own lives. Sometimes it takes even a small change. Rabbi Nachman speaks to us of the fact that if someone moves even a hair's breadth towards the return to God and a return to his spiritual work, that causes the divine with all of its love to come to the aid of that person. Sometimes you don't need something totally new to transform. It can take a small step, and that small step, changing a Shabbos challah into a Purim challah, can bring one to great, great spiritual heights and elevation.
What we are going to do now is the Purim challah. The Purim challah is called kulich, and it's one of the centerpieces of the Purim table at the Ashkenazi household. And what is special about the Purim challah is that it's sweeter, it has raisins in it, and it's normally much bigger than a normal challah, and you have only one. So let's start. I have here 750 grams of flour, and I'm going to add instant yeast and let it get mixed. 3 eggs, about 4 tablespoons of oil, and warm water, which I'll dissolve 3 tablespoons of honey. Okay, wonderful. And what I'm going to do now is to flour ball and the ball of the, and cover, and we leave for about 30 minutes proving. Now that the dough has proved, let's shape it. Look at it. It's wonderful. So I'm taking it out. And first I'll knead those raisins into it. Just a quick knead. Okay. Now that the raisins are mixed in. So first of all, we have to cut the dough into 3 equal parts and roll each into a ball. Now, after I divided them into 3 parts, I'm going to roll each part into a long, even sausage. And 3. Now to the plaiting. The idea is that this shape is very late in Jewish history, that it came from Germany, and it was the shape that the pagans used to bake for the goddess Brechta. The Jews kind of adopted the shape, and they call it challah after the name of the portion that was given to the priest in the temple. You had to separate some of the dough and give it to the priest, and that was called challah, and that's what it's called after. And after we shaped it, we give it gilding, as it used to be called, of egg. Just an egg wash, and it has now to prove for a further about 25-30 minutes with the instant yeast. If you use real yeast, it takes longer. The challah is now proved and ready to go to the oven, and it will go to a preheated oven, 180 degrees, for about 25 to 30 minutes. And I have here some sugar that I melted down over the fire with a bit of water, just a drop of water. And I'm going to brush that over the challah. And to give it the last kind of festive touch, I'll return the challah for about 2 to 3 minutes to the oven just to dry it up.
Interesting that at that time there was a lot of assimilation among the Jews, because the name Mordechai and the name Esther, neither of them are Hebrew names. Right. They were actually names taken from the Gentiles.
Yeah. Well, the name, I know from what I've been teaching over the years, that the Esther, it comes from the word lahastir, which means to hide. Yeah. So her identity was hidden because of all Mordechai told her, don't reveal your identity to Achashverosh.
So that's why we wear masks.
That's why we wear masks.
That's
one of the reasons. Her was Hadassah, yes.
No kosher food for her in the palace.
That's right.
So she ate a lot of bob, which is a broad bean, and it's very nourishing. It's got a lot of protein. Right. And then she was probably the first vegetarian, because she couldn't reveal her identity, so there was no kosher food for her. So she did very well on vegetarian food. And her favorite was the bob. It's a broad bean, very tasty.
There is a teaching in the Kabbalah that there are times when one must immerse oneself in evil itself, in the darkness itself, in order to create light and salvation. Esther is a mystery. She is one who is hidden, and she is one who sacrificially and voluntarily seems to have entered the realm of darkness so that light could be brought to the Jewish people. It is a deep, deep mystical teaching, and that is why her name expresses the teaching of to obscure, to hide, to be so difficult to understand, to be beyond description, to enter realms which most people would choose not to enter. But nonetheless, out of her sacrificial entrance into the darkness, we celebrate Purim as the result of the light that she brought out of her own sacrifice. Truly a woman of mystery.
Guess what we did at school today?
What did you do at school, Daniel?
Well, I mean, we went to the carnival.
Wow.
And there was this big parade. And we got to eat hamantash. It was delicious. Yeah.
There are many people who refer to Purim as a children's holiday. It's not, but it's a holiday filled with high spirits that often we project it upon the children so we do not have to deal with it on our own. But Purim is about the most powerful energy of the world, the light and the darkness in the world outside, but also the light and darkness within us as well.
In the language of analytical psychology, we all have shadows. We all have deep, dark parts of ourselves that we choose not to acknowledge, that even frighten us, and that we try to keep at bay. Every one of us knows in our individual lives that every day is a balance between our own light and our own darkness, as Hasidus would say, between our animal soul and our divine soul. As the Alter Rebbe teaches in Tanya, the Benoni, the so-called intermediate person, is one who fights with his inclinations every day, trying to rise above them and ultimately elevate himself and fulfill his spiritual responsibilities. So in the outside world, so it is with each one of us. The battle is constant and daily, and the Alter Rebbe tells us that we should not be disheartened by the battle, but know that our efforts every day of our lives brings pleasure to God and literally is an important aspect in the transformation of the universe.
Chag Purim, Chag Purim, Chag Gadol HaYeladim, Masechot Rashanim, Shirim Verikudim, Havana Risha, Rosh, 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 Havana Risha, Rosh, Havana Risha, Rosh, Rashanim.
We should have had this table in shul. We could have had a lovely noise with it. How many mitzvot have we mentioned over here that one is supposed to carry out on Purim? We mentioned tzedakah, which is like matanot levyonim. Okay. We said mishluach manot, sending gifts to the family and friends. Reading the Megillah, it's Kriyat Megillah, and what we're doing now, it's Seudat Mitzvah.
To feast.
To feast. It's a mitzvah to feast.
Why is that?
On all occasions that we have a chag, or a holy day or a holiday, it's celebrated with feasting, with wine, and with good food.
But everything in moderation. With the exception of Purim. Purim we just let go. We can even get drunk.
Yes.
To such an extent that we want to recognize the difference between Mordechai and Haman.
We reach that stage we don't know the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Arur Haman.
Right.
So Baruch Mordechai, you understand, is blessed is Mordechai, and Arur Haman is cursed is Haman.
The Kabbalists speak to us that every holiday of the Jewish year has its own energy, which can bring us to a new spiritual level if we choose to enter it with courage and with intention and with determination.
Any other examples since Haman or before Haman of Amaleks?
Well, there are many.
Oh, what?
Of men like Haman. In our history, we had many Hamans in our history. The most recent one was Hitler in the 20th century.
But specifically origin from Amaleks, the people, the Amalek people.
Well, we call anybody an Amalek who's determined to exterminate the Jews.
The Megillah Esther reveals that Haman is descended from Amalek, whose descendants attacked the Israelites during the Exodus from Egypt. Those considered descendants of the lineage of Amalek have often been enemies of the Jewish people.
And the Rebbe says to us that one should not think that Amalek is just to be understood as external opponents, but the Rebbe teaches us that Amalek also represents all those things within us that make us spiritually cold, that remove our enthusiasm for the spiritual path, for Torah, for prayer, for the performance of mitzvahs. The Rebbe tells us that Amalek can be expressed in depression. Amalek can be expressed in anything that enervates us, takes away our desire for godliness and for doing our work as Jews in the tikkun, in the repair and upliftment of the world. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov teaches over and over again that to be a soul incarnated in the physical world is to always deal in a world of balance between the light and the dark. The Rebbe speaks to us of the obstacles that occur to everyone in their attempt to improve themselves and seek to elevate themselves and the world.